Hello, I'm Philip McMurray from the Environmental Policy Division of the Department of Environment, Agriculture and Rural Affairs, and I'm going to give you a brief overview on the plastic packaging tax. So for an outline of the session, I'm going to go through and do an introduction and give you some background to the plastic packaging tax, and then we're going to look at the four key policy areas covering the scope of the tax, the liability for the tax, how exports will be handled, and then the exclusions for small operators are the de minimis exclusions. So taking us back to 1955, plastic was a new dawn that was going to make lives so much better. The strapline for this Life magazine cover was "Disposable items will cut down household chores, liberating the American housewife from drudgery." The items would take 40 hours to clean, except that no housewife need bother. We were celebrating throwaway living back in 1955. Roll on to now, however, and everybody is aware of the downsides of plastic. Programs like the Blue Planet and the Story of Plastic have shown that our misuse of plastic has a cost on our environment. So how has the government responded to this problem of plastic? Well, in 2018, they launched a call for evidence on single-use plastic waste, and this highlighted that recycled plastic is often more expensive than using new plastic. And therefore, in the budget in 2018, the government committed to introducing a world-leading new tax on plastic packaging to encourage the use of recycled plastic. They're now going through a 5-stage process of consultation with the public before introducing new legislation. Stage 1 was going through setting out objectives and identifying the options. That's been part of the call for evidence and the budget. Stage 2 was actually engaging in the first consultations, and there have been 2 of those so far. The first consultation was back in 2019, February 2019, and the responses were published in July 2019. And following that, they launched a second consultation outlining areas where the government had confirmed its position, and they also presented other areas, both revised and new, where the government was looking for further views. This consultation closed actually a short time ago in August 2020. It had been due to close in May, but because of the COVID pandemic, it was extended until August. That response is now being compiled and the responses are being analysed. So that will be the end of stage 2 of that 5-stage process, and the government will now move into stage 3, where we're looking at drafting new legislation. So what are the key decisions that have been taken on packaging tax? Well, in Budget 2020, the government announced its key decisions that from April 2022, the plastic packaging tax will be charged on plastic packaging which has been manufactured in or imported into the UK and that contains less than 30% recycled plastic. This tax will be charged at a rate of £200 per tonne. The tax will also be charged on imported filled plastic packaging, and there will be a de minimis threshold set of 10 tonnes of plastic packaging annually. Any producer that manufactures or imports less than 10 tonnes of plastic packaging annually will not be liable for this tax. And this is to ensure that the administrative burden of that tax is not disproportionate to environmental harms that the tax seeks to address. So what is the scope for the tax? Well, all plastic packaging that contains less than 30% recycled plastic will be within scope for the tax. And the tax will be applied on the packaging components within the plastic packaging. What does that mean? Well, with multi-material packaging, it needs to be predominantly plastic by weight to be taxable, i.e. the plastic must be the single greatest material by weight. If the plastic is not the single greatest material by weight, then the whole item is not considered plastic packaging. So it's only liable for the tax if the single greatest material is plastic. And I'll explain that a little bit further using a couple of examples from the government consultation. So in the first example, if an item of packaging weighs 10 grams, and that's made up of 4 grams of plastic, 3 grams of aluminium, and 3 grams of cardboard, then the item is within the scope, because with the 4 grams of plastic, that's clearly the greatest component by weight. But note that all 10 grams of packaging will be taxable. The tax will be paid on the 10 grams, not just on the 4 grams of plastic. With another example, with again a 10-gram item, if there's 3 grams of plastic, 4 grams of aluminium, and 3 grams of cardboard, then that item is out of scope and no tax is payable. And what counts towards the 30% threshold? Well, only post-consumer recycled material and pre-consumer material which has been reprocessed will count towards the 30% threshold, and all methods of recycling of this plastic will be permissible. The government is considering an exemption for packaging in immediate contact with licensed medicines, so packaging for medicines could be exempt, but note that packaging for medical devices is not foreseen as being exempt from the tax. So in terms of liability for the tax, when will it be chargeable on a product? Well, again, following the majority of respondents from the first consultation, they supported that the tax will be chargeable when plastic material is converted into packaging, so that that's the moment at which the tax applies. If the conversion occurs overseas, then whoever is importing that packaging will be liable to pay the tax. The government proposes that transport packaging used to import goods, so crates, etc., will not be in the scope of the tax. It'll actually be the packaging on goods itself. And to increase the visibility of the tax to businesses purchasing such plastic packaging, the government proposes that the taxable person should make the tax visible on their sales invoice, so that it's clear where the tax is being applied and what it's being applied for. Moving on to exports, how will UK manufacturers remain competitive with exports outside of the UK? Some of you may ask. Well, exported plastic packaging will be relieved from the tax to ensure that there's not an undue disadvantage when you're exporting goods overseas. Tax credits can be claimed by this taxable person for plastic packaging which is exported after the tax point, providing that they have the evidence to support their claim. But following again the first consultation, a slight change was made that where it is known that at the point that the tax is due, the packaging will be exported by someone other than the manufacturer, importer, or the importer, then the packaging can move through the supply chain with the tax suspended and without the tax being payable. On the other hand, if it's not known at the point that the tax is payable, whether it will be exported or not, then the manufacturer or importer will need to claim the credit at a later date once the packaging has been exported. And now we'll move on to the de minimis exclusions. I mentioned at the start that there's a de minimis threshold of 10 tonnes per annum. Now that will be based on the weight of the plastic packaging, and it will include in its scope, the calculation of the de minimis will include all packaging, whether it contains above or below the 30% recycled plastic, whether it's destined for export, or whether it's covered by the proposed exemption, for instance, for the medical packaging. So all the packaging that's used by a business will be included in that calculation of the 10 tonnes. But any business that is below that threshold and is not creating 10 tonnes of plastic packaging per year will be exempt from paying the tax. Note just one final point there on the slide, that the transport packaging on imported goods will not be included in the calculation for that de minimis threshold. So that's been a brief run through, and I'll just do a little recap. We've seen the reasons for the tax being about the growing public concern about the excessive amounts of plastic in our environment and the lack of an incentive to use recycled plastic to date, the extra cost of recycled plastic versus virgin plastic. We had a look at the scope of the tax relating to all plastic with less than 30% recycled content. I talked about the liability for the tax and the tax being chargeable when the plastic is converted into packaging and including imported packaging in that calculation. I noted that the exports will be exempt from the tax. There will be provisions to allow for that. And finally, we looked at the de minimis threshold of 10 tonnes and how business manufacturers are importing quantities of packaging below this threshold on an annual basis are not required to register for the tax. So that was that quick run through of the tax that the government's proposing to introduce from April 2022. The consultations, as I said, on the design of the tax have finished now. The next stage will be draft legislation, and the government will be launching a consultation on the future of that. You'll be able to find more detail on that consultation document, and you can find that by simply entering plastic packaging tax consultation into your favorite web browser, and it'll bring it up pretty quickly for you. I'll point out though that this tax is a reserved matter, so it's the Westminster government are introducing the tax. It's not the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. We are not we're not designing any legislation for this. We have in the past arranged some people from Her Majesty's Treasury and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs to come and talk to local stakeholders, but we are not directly involved in setting the tax or drafting the legislation. I'll also point out that the new tax will complement both the UK Plastics Pact, for those of you that are members of this, and indeed the wider Ellen MacArthur New Plastic Economy Global Commitment. And it'll support these on the targets to achieve both an average recycled content in packaging, but also to increase the amount of plastic packaging that is actually recycled. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for your time. I'll be happy to take any questions during the question and answer session later. Thank you.